Welcome to Yin and Young. The following is a story taken from Chapter 1. I have called it A Tired, Pale Eye. I hope you enjoy it. Much in contrast to Qianlong, Yin Lin's mother Zhuyu was not happy. Even the most beautiful moonrise on a September evening brought her tears, not of a melancholy beauty, but something tragic. For her the moon was not the peaceful glow of companionship, but a tired, pale eye. Zhuyu interpreted the early struggles of her life quite differently from Qianlong. Zhuyu was born into a home that had servants. Her father owned several stores, and she had a clear memory of sitting on the front counter of the store as a young child. One of the employees opened a glass jar with many colorful candies inside. "Try some," the clerk coaxed her. "Wow, so beautiful," she thought. Inside the glass jar were many colorfully wrapped little packages of sweetness. She reached in, carefully attempting to select one of each color, pink, yellow, brown, blue, and green, while the clerk watched on. Somewhere in the back of the store, her father attended to business matters, and his voice could be heard among the sounds of shuffling and other movements. As Zhuyu placed one after another bonbon on the counter, the clerk brought a silk bag with a tie string, placed a handful of extra candies inside, and offered the bag to Zhuyu. "Here, you can put your candies inside," he said, in a gentle but masculine voice. Zhuyu had already removed the wrapping from one of the flavored goodies, and with careful accounting placed each one of the remaining candies in the bag. She had just placed a yellow toffee in her mouth, and found another yellow one to replace it. Each of us wakes into consciousness at certain moments in our lives. This moment, the tangy sweetness of the candies, the fresh, sugary scent, the decorative jar with all its reflections of light and color, and being perched like a little princess on the countertop, was Zhuyu's earliest memory, her waking moment in life. This moment, in her clean white dress with lacy-topped socks and polished shoes, was her earliest memory when she first noticed both herself and the world she lived in. She was a young girl, served by a tall, well-groomed clerk. Tasty objects were her treasure in a kingdom ruled by her father, and she was the princess. It was a happy life. A sweet life, a child's dream. When her father finished his business, he briskly headed to the side entrance of the store. Looking toward the clerk and in a low voice, her father directed that the clerk bring her. The clerk nodded, then lifted Zhuyu from the counter and placed her on the floor. To one of her hands he offered the bag of candies. To the other hand he offered his own outstretched forefingers. She grasped his fingers, and the clerk slowly walked her through to the door, where a palanquin and 6 bearers were waiting on the street. The clerk lifted Zhuyu inside and set her beside her mother, who was already fanning herself on the forward-facing seat. Zhuyu was still too young to know that her father, who followed her into the carriage and sat opposite to Wu Wen, inherited the family business, and that actually they owned 3 stores. She was too young to know that her mother's small and decorative feet, wrapped as attractively as any candy, was a sign of her status as a female, and as a woman devoted to Confucian values. And when they returned home, she ran through the entrance, unaware yet of how large their home was. At her young age, life in the house itself was a yet-to-be-fully-explored adventure. Her days were a bliss of ever-new discoveries as she found rooms she hadn't seen before, drawers that concealed various mementos, and doors large and small that she never yet opened. Her days of play gave her a feeling that life was large and inviting. Each day flowed into the next in a dream of endless possibility. Several months later, the family was on their way to their summer house in the country. To Zhuyu, it seemed that something was different about their move. Something unsettled her and made her alert. Was it because she had noticed for the first time the sour odor of the countryside? Was she able to perceive a difference in the manners of the country neighbors compared to the servants back home? She closed the curtain beside her seat in the shoulder carriage as they traveled, but she could sometimes hear the reluctance of others on the road to make way for their passage. When they arrived at the entrance, she noticed, as she retreated into the hidden chambers of her home, that her father was in some dispute with the bearers of the carriage. But more than anything she noticed as time passed, and she searched from room to room, that there were no longer any servants to prepare her meals or help her with her clothes. Over the coming days she tended to be on her own for long periods, often without eating, and soon decided she didn't like her summer home, and wondered how long before they would go back. No one answered her questions directly. Though their country home was smaller than the one they left in the city, like the city home, it was done in the traditional courtyard style. This structure dominated the landscape, which was otherwise surrounded by many smaller homes, mostly built of mud and bamboo, sometimes kept cool by pasting pig manure on the walls. In contrast to these homes, which were mostly the size of a single room, Zhuyu's family lived in a compound. The entrance faced south and required that you pass through the ancestral shrine. In the daytime, this set of altars with incense and candles seemed dirty and smelly to Zhuyu, but every time they passed she was required to bow and pray for their ancestors, whose ashes were displayed on the shelves, and whose images and words hung on the wall. The worst was after sunset. The flickering of candles created an illusion of movement, and a breeze passing through the grating made it seem as if you could hear the ancestors breathing. It felt like a bedroom of death, and the ancestors were whispering to her. Even in the day it was hard for Zhuyu to pass through this portal without recalling death. She always quickened her pace with goosebumps crawling on her body, either coming in or going out, through this only entrance into the house. Once through the entrance and across the courtyard, to the opposite side, there was a building which housed a large room where there were a number of tables, some high and some low, and various chairs and mats, as well as a large kang. This was the area where the family gathered most frequently, both for socializing and eating. Zhuyu's mother and father already raised 2 boys. One of them, Zhu, was in the army, and the other, Zhu Wei, married several years ago to Lu Ai, and established a family in the country near the summer house. Zhu Wei came over with a pot of pork soup and rice. There was talking, but as usual these days it sounded unhappy. "Always take the big piece?" Zhuyu's mother said, frowning at Zhu Zheng beside her at the table. Father Zheng was already swallowing the meat, eagerly slurping some broth from his bowl. "They are the same size," replied Father. "You just eat." "And what is Yu going to eat?" Father didn't reply. He sat with his legs apart and each foot flat on the floor, as the master at the table, completely absorbed in his soup. Brother Wei offered some words about using the land around the house and the need to grow their own food. Again, Father didn't reply. He only paused to suck on some tea. He wasn't used to being in such a position. He continued chomping noisily on his soup and rice. Normally, he was commander of a big company, making fateful decisions. But now he had to think about all the low things he had no familiarity with, like how to grow the food he needed and who will cook it. Life, suddenly reduced to bare necessities, irritated him greatly. Meanwhile, his wife, picking at the bone in her bowl, stared at him, saying in a shrill voice, "Look at this! How do I eat this? You are finishing the one piece of meat that could have been broken into 3 pieces. All I have is a bone." Father was having trouble keeping everything in his mind, and his wife sitting beside him repeating the same thing about eating too much, and his son saying that there were details that needed taking care of, pressed him to his limit. She pushed further. "Do you even think about your family?" "Keep quiet, woman," he shouted. Food flicked out of his mouth and little bits landed on the table. Somewhere in the loud bickering, Zhuyu came to consciousness. It was morning, and Zhuyu was playing in her room, unaware that her uncle had come to visit. The conversation filtered through the door into her ears and finally into her body. Zhuyu was already familiar with the coolness between her mother and father. Back in the city, they did not actually spend so much time in the same room, but there was something new about their manner. It was more abrupt, with less of that formal respect she was used to. The mood did not feel like the holiday away from the city that she anticipated, and the emotional tone, like the theme at the start of a movie, prepared her for the truth that was to come. The government had recently abolished private property and had begun the process of redistribution to serve the revolutionary cause. The Zhu family, until recently, had more than one home, and local officials decided that the Jews were to relocate to the country and leave their city home to be repopulated with more deserving people. The day Zhuyu happily waved goodbye to the house servants, she hadn't noticed their tears, and was not aware that she would never again return to her happy playground in the city. Words from outside her bedroom echoed along the walls where the sun shining through the blinds left sharp shadows. She stopped to listen. Something difficult was happening, and even her father didn't know the solution. What are we going to do?" Father Jing said. Zhuyu was not accustomed to her father speaking this way. She strained to hear him as his tone was barely audible. "We're getting old now, and we'll need to do something about Yu. Yu blinked. Her heart pounded as she held her breath. What does it mean, do something about Yu? "You can teach Zhuyu how to cook and clean," Uncle Wei offered. His mother Wu Wen got up from the table and walked with a slight wobble to sit in the chair at the far side, while her husband and son continued their discussion. She was a largish woman and sat with a sigh. "How can your mother do that?" Father Zhu replied. "Even your mother has never cooked or cleaned till now. The only thing Yu will be is a burden. We need someone to take her." Yu's heart started racing. The strangeness of recent days, combined with her memory of the smoky shrine at the entrance, the rudeness of the country people, all accumulated in her mind, and now the danger that she might be separated from her parents, created a hunger inside her that was deeper than anything she felt in her life. She didn't understand that her father was only pretending, and had no desire to give Yu away, but hoped that Uncle Wei and Aunt Ai would take responsibility for Yu while Father Jen and his wife Wu Wen settled into their new life in the country. Yu would be able to bridge relations with Wei and Ai that had been damaged years earlier. The problem was that Father Jen and Mother Wen had never approved of the marriage of Brother Wei and Lu Ai. They looked down on Lu Ai as illegitimate because she was both older than Brother Wei and had been married once already. To their view, she tricked their son into marriage when he could have done much better. Brother Wei, for his part, would have liked to take care of Yu, but he had his own children. It was already difficult living on the farm, and bringing Yu into their home would only expose Lu Ai to further scorn and abuse from Ju Wei's parents. Brother Wei did not want to face this and felt it would not be good for anyone, including Yu. In order to put an end to such talk, Uncle Wei suggested, "Father, we know someone who could take Yu, but they do not live nearby. They are good people. They do not have children and could use an extra set of hands on the farm. They are willing to take a young child as a member of their own family and do the work of teaching her how to be useful. But she would be far away. You might not see her, except perhaps once a year." He knew that such an action would mean that Yu would basically become another family's servant, and the humility of such a thing would be too much to bear. He did not expect his father to agree. Father Zhu did not reply. He looked instead to his wife Wen, who returned his look with no expression on her face. Father Zhu, who had been used to giving orders and seeming to be the lord of fate, found himself at a loss for how to handle this situation. Something snapped in Zhuyu, and her body moved with purpose. She burst out of the shadows of her room, running across the floor to her mother. Burying her head in her mother's lap with tears and sobs, she cried, "I'm a good cook!" Looking first up into her mother's face and then over to her father, she repeated, "I'm a good cook! And I could clean also. I'm good at cleaning." While almost shouting in her little child voice, she pushed off her mother's lap and in rapid, leaping child steps hasted to where the broom was resting. "Watch me! Look!" she started, sweeping motions in the center of the floor, using both hands to create a long arc. "You see? I'm cleaning. Watch me! Watch!" She continued sweeping the room, leaning one foot forward and then back to her heels. Uncle Wei looked in her direction and said, Yu, have you ever cooked before? I don't think so." Yu spoke out almost fiercely while still sweeping energetically. "I watch the cooks at home. It's easy to cook. I can do it so good." "You see?" She quickly moved the dust pile and pushed it into the corner of the room. She dropped the broom and, attempting to place a convincing smile on her face, now stained with tears, in a flurry of legs, she picked up a small stool. Placing it at the base of the table, she stood on the stool and reached here and there to arrange the items on the table. "You see? The floor is clean. It's easy. You see how hard I work?" She hurriedly cleared off a few small dishes and knocked one of the cups to the floor. She stopped, looking at her father, and lowered her head, bowing, and then quickly jumped from the stool, set the dishes on a lower table, and picked up the cup, rinsing it in a bucket nearby. Father Zhang looked at Yu. "Come here and bring me that cup," he said. Yu looked over her shoulder and turned to bring the cup. "Give it to me," Father Zhang said. "You cleaned it, right?" Yu nodded her head and quickly shook the water off the cup, wiping her face with the sleeve of one arm. She raised the cup, still shining from wetness, in both hands to her father, while lowering her head once again. pour me some tea?" he said to her quietly. He gazed directly at her, his dark eyes still, as if peering out from his own shadows, while Zhuyu reached up, sprinkled some tea leaves into the cup, and grabbed the heavy pot in both hands. Father Zhu lowered his cup, and Zhuyu raised her arms to pour the tea. Brother Wei watched while Mother Wen just looked down to a cloth she fidgeted with between her hands. She was slowly unwrapping one of her feet. Zhuyu placed the pot down on the near edge of the table with a slight thud and stood back, staring at her father. She wiped her hands on her sides. Father Zheng set the teacup on the table and said, "Thank you, daughter." But Zhuyu didn't rest. Glancing at her mother, she pulled a large basin from under one of the small tables and placed it at her mother's feet. Grabbing a bottle of scented oil, she poured a small amount into the basin. Using the same pot she had just used for tea, Zhuyu poured steaming water into the basin, then transferred a few bowlfuls of cooler water, scooped out of another pot. She mixed the two to create a warm scented water solution, while her mother watched. Standing, Zhuyu reached out, gently pulled the cloth from her mother's hand, then knelt again to unwrap the remainder of her mother's left foot. She slipped the distorted foot into the scented water, and then continued by unwrapping the right foot, placing it into the water as well. Slowly she began to rub one foot, then the other, getting the oil into the folds of the skin between and under the toes. While doing so, she gazed up into her mother's eyes with a determined look of love. Wu Wen closed her eyes, and a quiet settled into the room as Father Zheng sipped his tea, admiring his daughter, while trying to comprehend what was happening to their lives. Brother Wei stood from his chair, poured the remaining few vegetables and broth into a bowl, nodding to Zhuyu, saying, "There's soup here." Zhuyu didn't look over, but kept her gaze focused on her mother, whose eyes still remained shut. Zhuyu tilted her head slightly, let her eyelids droop a bit, and said, "I will eat after Mom and Baba are taken care of." Wu Wen opened her eyes slightly, gazing down at her daughter with a watery gaze, but then closed them once again. This was Zhuyu's second awakening. It made her first awakening in the store sampling candy seem to be no awakening at all, but a dream that was long forgotten. Any goodness to come into her life in the future would never again trick her like the candy in the store. From that day forward, Zhuyu remained awake to the harshness of her life, and became the young caretaker of her mother and father. She was only a child, but she had, in fact, watched the cooks carefully back at their home in the city, and she also had a natural instinct about what sort of work needed to be done. Though she lacked physical strength, she was already sharp-witted and had boundless energy. Strength and experience came to her over time, and she became very good at her job. She was a city girl, however, and her classmates isolated her for her city manners and too careful concern about dirt and smell. Despite their judgments and the social isolation it caused, she would sleep by the side of the road so that the passing of people early in the morning would wake her before the dawn. While the pale moon hung in the sky, she would race to the fields to gather chicken manure, which she gave to an agent to be weighed and counted. If she got a large enough amount of chicken manure, she would be given her daily food ticket, and this would increase the family's supply. Once her morning work was completed, she would return home, wash off the smell, then go to school, then return home to clean and cook. She was a determined and proficient girl. Her mother and father never had to clean or cook. She took care of them as her childhood passed, from one episode of hard work to another, gathering chicken manure, washing, cooking, cleaning, going to school, gathering food, cooking, cleaning, washing, studying, sleeping. At night, as she lay in the dirt near the walking path, she calculated how she could gather more manure than the other children the next day. Yin Lin, together with her father, looking at the bath photo, would, as time passed, come to know the difficult early life of both her parents. As she remembered the sparkle and splash of that warmy bath, surrounded by love and attention, she did not know yet that she would have her own story. She simply thought about the fun life she had at the barracks. It was her awakening, and life for Yin Lin was just beginning.